Right, you're down on base 14b. The Mishnah gave a whole list of short, brief statements about nezek, and without much interpretation. And as Rashi says in the Mishnah, Rashi doesn't even bother to explain the Mishnah. Rashi says the Gemara will explain the Mishnah for you. Okay, and we're at 1 second. About halfway down the page, Amar Ravashi. Amar Ravashi is the first words. The question is as follows: the Mishnah says you can pay with shaveh kesef, equivalent to money. And the question is, what exactly does that mean? So the Gemara begins explaining that shaveh kesef actually doesn't mean objects. It means specifically property. The Gemara attempted to say that maybe the reason why it means property is because the question is, how does shaveh kesef mean property? Why is that the implication? So the Gemara suggested first that it could be the implication is because property does not have the laws of Ainah. So property could always be worth the value of the entire amount of damages. Well, the Gemara pointed out that an Eved and a Shtar don't either have Ainah. In other words, if a person sells a slave, there's no Ainah to a slave either. And similarly, if a person sells a debt to somebody else, there's no Ainah as well. So therefore, it can't be that the reason that it doesn't have Ainah is the cause for why it's considered shaveh kesef, because that would include other things as well. It would include slaves and debts. Okay, so Amar Rashi suggests as follows: shaveh kesef v'loy kesef, v'hani kula kesef minu. When the Mishnah says shaveh kesef, it implies something that's worth money, but not money itself. However, objects can always be transferred; they can always be moved. So therefore, objects are always considered to be money. So Rabbi Yehudah bar Chinna l'Ravuna. So if Yehudah bar Chinna had a question for Ravuna bar Yeshua. Tana shaveh kesef melamed she'ein bezin niskakin elal l'nechasam sheyesh lahen achrayas. 1 second. Rabbi Yehudah bar Chinna l'Ravuna. So Rabbi Yehudah bar Chinna asked a question to Ravuna. Tana shaveh kesef. The Mishnah says shaveh kesef melamed she'ein bezin niskakin elal l'nechasam sheyesh lahen achrayas. The Mishnah, we are explaining the Mishnah to refer to property. In other words, when it comes time to pay, Bezin takes property. So he asks him, Vatanya, we learned, Yoshev l'Rav is shaveh kesef afilu subin. It's not true you have to pay property. You could also pay with objects. Shaveh kesef means you pay with bran. So he answered him, Hachamay askinan biyasmin. We're talking about from the estate. As we mentioned in the past, in the time of the Gemara, you were not able to collect metalflin, movable items, objects from an estate, only property. And we said today, after the decree of the Gainim, you could collect objects as well. Okay, Ibiasmi Ema Seifa. If we're referring to the inheritance, then let's look at the end. Let's look at the end of the Brisa. In Kodem Nizik B'Tafas Metalflin Bezin Goyva Lemihem. If the guy takes metalflins, he goes ahead and grabs objects, then Bezdin will allow him to collect from those objects. There's just one problem. Ibi asked me, am I Bezdin Goyven Lemehem? If they take from the inheritance, it's only the property of the estate that's responsible to pay the inheritance, not the objects. So if he takes an object, then why would Bezdin allow him to collect? The object was taken from the inheritance. He has no right to take it. So Gemara says, because Amar Rav Amar Nachman Shtofas Mechayim, Achanami Shtofas Mechayim. We're talking about a scenario where he stole it as collateral while the guy was still alive. So that tfisa works. It's only tfisa lachar mitz that doesn't work if you grab it after the guy dies. If you remember, we had a Gemara about this. Tfisa lachar mitz, where two rabbis tried to steal a ship. That was after the guy died. Okay. Bifnei Bezdin. You have when you pay for damages, it has to be done in front of a court. What exactly does that mean? Okay, so the Gemara suggests what exactly does it mean in front of a court? Perhaps it means that the guy has to have property when he stands in front of court. Let's say the guy sells his property before he gets to court, so then Bezdin wouldn't deal with it. We would not collect from the Lekuchas. So the Gemara says, but that's not the case. Shema mina lovo Does that mean to say that you don't collect from the kuchas? Of course you collect from the kuchas. You'll collect from whoever he sold it to. So that can't be the meaning of the Mishnah. Gemara says you can't go to a court that's made up of regular people. They have to be rabbis. Yeah. Okay. We'll get to it. It's more than just okay. We'll get to it soon. It could potentially is more than just hedonitis. In other words, it could be that the we'll see. Karen potentially is a knas, a penalty, and a penalty requires a properly constituted bezdin in order to enforce it. So therefore, a court of regular people is not even if they're rabbis, as long as they don't have smicha. Smicha is not what we call today smicha. Today we don't have smicha anymore. Smicha has been gone for well over 1,000 years. We have a similar thing to smicha, but you need rabbis that are smuchin, real smicha, to be able to give a penalty. And we'll get to it shortly. Api edim, through witnesses. Okay, so we'll soon see. Karen, the half payment of Karen is a knas. It's a penalty payment. And therefore, if you admit that your animal went ahead and damaged somebody else and gored another animal, then if you admit that, then you pay. If you admit that, there's a penalty payment of half that. I'm sorry. If you admit it, you do not pay chatzi netzik. You don't pay half the damages, because anytime you admit to committing a crime that incurs a penalty, then you don't pay the penalty. For example, if a guy admits to rape, einus, then he'd pay for the damages and the embarrassment, but he would not pay the penalty payment of 50 coins. Similarly, if he admits that his animal is shor hamuad, a wild animal, I'm sorry, not a wild animal,
domestic.
No, an animal that has habituated. Thank you, habituated animal, habituated to violent behavior, kills a slave. He admits to it, so then he doesn't have to pay the penalty of 30 coins, which is typically the penalty that he'd pay otherwise. So over here, that's what the Mishnah is saying. You need to, if you have to have witnesses. Why? Because if the guy admits before the witnesses come to court, then he doesn't make the penalty payment. He doesn't pay half damages. So the Gemara says, "Well, this is true. It might have been So in general, it's a fundamental debate. A guy admits to wrongdoing to get out of the penalty payments, and then witnesses come and testify that he's committed that crime. Does he exempt himself? In other words, is it that as soon as you admit you're exempt from the payments, or it's because you can't pay the penalty payment until the witnesses come? So if you're the only one admitting that you did a crime, then if you're the only one admitting, so then you can't get penalized. But when witnesses come, then you would be able to get penalized. So that's the debate.
Oh,
The guy admits to committing a sin that has a penalty, and then witnesses come that he committed that sin. Is he exempt from payment or not? Okay, so exactly. Just making notes.
well, I guess one of the questions would be, how does the judicial system here treat a case that's essentially already settled? What are the rules about reopening a case? I mean, if it's already been adjudicated, then do you reopen it, or do you just say, sorry, the case is settled in the past?
There might be a way to think of the debate. Okay, so this makes sense. According to the opinion that says that if witnesses come afterwards, he'd be exempt. In other words, obviously you need witnesses to make somebody pay for damages. So who cares if in other words, originally we were saying you need witnesses because if he admits, then he's exempt. But there is an opinion that says if he admits, he isn't exempt. So how do you explain the mission according to that opinion?
We're on 15A now, Rabbi.
We're about to turn the page. So Gemara says, "Seifa it's shirchalei," top of Tesvav and Aleph. The Gemara says you're right. Obviously, you need to have witnesses to make somebody pay damages. That's fine. The main point of the mission is really the next 2 points. B'nei chayrin u'b'nei bris. They have to be free men and Jews. B'nei chayrin l'miyutei avodim. B'nei chayrin excludes slaves. B'nei bris l'miyutei epikachavim. That excludes idol worshippers. In other words, if a Jew damages an idol worshiper, he's not required to pay, and we'll get to more detail on that in the Laments when we get to it again. But tzricha, it's necessary. The yeshmin and evan mishum de elon yachas, avnocher yesh yachas emaloi. Like we pointed out, a slave is not considered to have a father, even if he happens to know who his father is. Whereas a non-Jew is considered to have a father. There's no yichus, there's no genealogy for a slave, but there is for a non-Jew. So there would be a reason to think that a slave, even though he's technically Jewish, but because he has no genealogy, you would not have to make, if you damage him, you wouldn't have to pay. But a non-Jew, you would have to pay. I would think that it's specifically a non-Jew that's excluded because he doesn't have mitzvahs. But a slave that does have mitzvahs, maybe you would be liable in damages. So that's why the Mishnah has to say that both a slave and a non-Jew would be exempt from damages. Okay, and there's no reason to think that a woman is any different than a man with regard to damages. How do we know this? When the Torah talks about atonement for sin, the Torah says man or woman. For any penalty of the Torah, man and woman are equal. This Gemara, by the way, is a repeat of what we saw in about 2 months ago in Kedushin. Next opinion, the Be'er of Elazar Tana, the students of Rabbi Elazar taught, these are the laws you should place in front of them, in front of men and women. With regard to all laws, men and women are equal. The Bechizkiya of Rabbi Lili Tana, the house of Chizkiya taught, Amar Kra v'himis ish ayisha hishvakas of ishal ish l'chol mis shabatorah. Second, yeah, this is if an animal kills a man or a woman, we see from here that with regard to dying, whether it's the death penalty or whether it's other penalties, men and women are equal. Okay, and the Mishnah says it's necessary for there to be 3 separate verses indicating men and women are equal. What are the 3 verses? What are the 3 verses for? One is for atonement. One is for, or really atonement and penalty. The other one is for law. And the third one is for death. Together? 3 verses. Atonement, law, and death. Okay. And the Gemara says it's necessary for all 3 verses to be pointed out. Why? Tzricha. The Yeshmin and Kamaisa would have just said atonement. When we talk about atonement, so God wants man and woman to be atoned. However, Avaldin, when it comes to law, it could be that the law is only applied to men. Maybe because men typically are the ones to engage in business, so they would include men only and not a woman. Okay, so that's what the Torah has to repeat itself and say that women also have the same set of laws as men with regards to the law. If the Torah just let us know that they're equal in regard to law, so then I would think since men have much more mitzvahs, it could be that the laws of atonement are different to them than for women. Maybe men were given the laws of atonement because they were given most of the mitzvahs, and women are not. Therefore, it's necessary for the verse to indicate both atonement and law are both men and women are equal. 1 second. If it would have just said those 2, okay, in other words, I would think that law and atonement are equal men and women. However, when it comes to death, specifically the payment of kaifer. Maybe kaifer is only paid when the animal kills a man, because the bar mitzvah, because a man has much more mitzvahs than a woman. The bar mitzvah l'shalom kaifer, there would be a penalty of kaifer. Ishaloi. So therefore, it needs to repeat itself. The verse needs to repeat itself and say, no. With regard to death, they're also equal. V'yeshmi and kaifer, if it would have just said with regard to death, because it's a loss of life, the Torah says men and women are equal. With regard to law or with regard to atonement, where there is no loss of life, so maybe we would say that a woman is not included, right? It's only a man that's included. So therefore, Kamash Malon, that a man and woman are equal with basically regard to virtually all of Torah law, with the exception of a mitzvah, specifically a mitzvah asay shazman grama. A positive commandment that has been caused by time.
Oh.
And there are many of them that both men and women are equal. So, for example, a woman is not obligated in Kriya Shema.
Right.
But certain things that are also time caused, Zman Garma, a woman is chayav on. For example, eating matzah on Pesach. Okay, hanizik v'hamazik v'tashlumin. The victim and the aggressor are part of the payment. Okay, that means sort of the victim is also participating in the payment, and we have to understand why is that. So let's explain. This is, by the way, very important Gemara. We've mentioned it so far probably at least 4 times, and we'll get and it will come up again later. It's a very important Gemara. And this is the Gemara I just mentioned before. Itmar, Palganiska, the half payment of Karen. Rav Papa Amar Mayna, Rav Huna bar Yeshua Amar Knosa. Rav Papa says it's a monetary payment, and Rav Huna says it is a penalty payment. So let's explain. Rav Papa Amar Mayna, Rav Papa says it's a monetary payment. Kasavar he holds Stam Shvarim Lav B'Cheskas Shimar Kaiman. A regular ox can be expected to occasionally act out and do damage. And therefore, it is your responsibility to make sure that your ox is under control should it get out of control. If that's the case, that if you, in general, like we pointed out right in the beginning of the Masechta, what is the most critical factor for determining if you're liable for damages? Especially in this game in Mainai. Okay, good, but more than just the owner. If you fail to watch it, you fail to watch it, right? We said if the robber broke through the middle of the night, what happens? The guy's a watchman, right? Robbers steal the animal goes and does damage. Who's chayav?
Middle of the night.
Middle of the night, robbers steal the animal, and then the robbers, obviously. And the same thing is true if the hurricane wind blew and knocked down the fence, and the animal went into the local store that was out of power, crashed its way in and broke things. Also, you're exempt. The key factor for being chayav on niskei mammon is that you should have watched it and you didn't. You should have. You had an obligation to watch it, and you did not follow through with your obligation. That's the key thing. Okay. Second. Okay. So therefore, ox owner is expected to understand that his ox will act out occasionally, and therefore he is responsible for watching his ox. If that's the case, how much damage should he have to pay in Karen? He should have to pay the whole thing. He's obligated to watch it. He didn't watch it. That's a full payment. He should make a full payment. The Torah says, you know what? It hasn't been habituated. It's hard to plan for it. I'm going to exempt. God says I'm going to exempt you from half the payment, because you really have to pay the whole thing. I'm making an exemption, and I'm exempting you from half. An exception, and I am exempting you from half. We're together in this.
Mm-hmm.
The other side is exactly the opposite. Okay, so this is the opinion that says palganiska knos palganiska memayda. Half payment is monetary. That means you should be paying a full payment. God says, okay, you know what? It'll be nice. I'll give you an exception. The other opinion is the opposite. He says it's a penalty. Why is it? one can safely presume his animal will not act out. It will not intentionally seek to inflict damages. Ubedinhu deloy l'shalom klal. And the truth of the matter is, there should be no payment at all. Why not? Why is there no payment?
Well, animals normally doesn't act out.
Very good. So the animal's watched. Animal's a watched animal. Animal's a watched animal. You don't, yeah.
Oh,
But under certain circumstances, an animal, you can.
Those are,
Be a source of potential
as they,
trouble.
as they say, those are
A
exceptional circumstances.
bull during heat, during mating season, that goes for some period of time, and they are extremely aggressive.
Yeah, so that seems to be an exceptional circumstance, and therefore, what I guess
If it goes for 2 months or something, that's a real span of time.
the point that you're making is an interesting point, which is that let's say you have an animal that's in heat and clearly positioned to do damage. Would that be different? It's a good question, and I'm not sure the answer to that. Okay, I heard the question specifically when an animal's in heat. It's a good question. I wonder. It might. I think the Gemara might actually mention the scenario, but that is an interesting point. But in general, we're not talking about when animals, in heat primed to do damage.
Just keep a bucket of cold water.
Okay. Okay. So therefore, we didn't do the shalom klal. If the animal's watched, you shouldn't make any payments. The Torah gives you a penalty payment of half the payment, so that you should be at least a little bit careful. In other words, because you're not going to be entirely careless, because you know that you'll have to pay at least half. Yeah, exactly. But now in both positions is compromise. The question is, which way are we compromising? According to one way, we're compromising from the top down. The other way, we're coming from the bottom up. You really have to pay zero. And Torah says that you pay half. The other opinion, you have to pay full payment. We're nice to make it half. Okay, what's obviously the difference here? The difference is what happens if the guy admits his animal to damage. If it's a monetary payment, it doesn't make a difference. If you admit you did a monetary damage, you have to make a monetary payment. If I admit to stealing your item, of course I have to pay for it. So if I admit my animal gores your animal and that goring is a monetary payment, then I have to pay half the damages. But if, on the other hand, it's a penalty payment, penalty payments you don't have to pay. So let's see. Tanan. The nizik and the mazik participate in the payment. If we say that half damages is monetary, so then it makes sense to say that the one who was damaged is a participant in the payment. Why is he a participant in the payments? Because really the payment should be a full payment. The Torah says, okay, we're going to be nice to you, we'll only make you pay half. So who carries the burden for the other half? The victim. The victim. So that makes sense. The victim and the aggressor participate in the damages. It's a fair statement. However, according to the opinion that says that half damages is a penalty, in other words, how much, according to the version that says paganiska, half payment is a penalty, how much does he deserve to get, the victim? How much is the victim deserving to say that half payment is a penalty?
Sounds like he's not getting anything.
Zero. He's not entitled to anything. So now the Torah makes him pay at least half. So how does he participate in the payments? In what way is he participant? He was supposed to get zero. Now the Torah gives him half. Okay, well, he got a bonus. He's taking what he doesn't even deserve. How does he participate in the payment then? Gemara says, like we pointed out before, the carcass is dealt with by the victim. And if the carcass degrades over the short period of time before it's actually sold, that degradation is the responsibility of the victim.
But the half payment is a penalty as opposed to compensation.
That's the debate here.
Yeah.
That's the debate. So one opinion says it's compensation. I like that word they use. My word might be better, but okay. Or it's a penalty. Yeah, if it's a compensation, then it's financial. It's monetary. It's regular tort law. Okay. So talking about so what happens? The guy kills an animal worth $1,000. How much does he pay? $500, right? But we subtract the value of the carcass at the time the animal was killed. Right? So if it was an older animal, it was a work animal primarily, so it was worth a lot more than the value of the meat. Meat was worth, I don't know, $200 at the time the animal died. So you only pay $300 then. And let's say, even though now, which is 2 days later, and the animal's still in the bottom of the pit, the meat is worth $50 now, because now it's dog food, effectively. It's still the guy pays. The guy pays. We evaluate it at the time it was damaged. The value of the carcass at the time the damage happened, which is $200. The guy will pay $300, half the payments. Okay, so Gemara is a tiny ratio. The Mishnah already pointed this out previously. Tashlume nezek malamet shabayla metapel benavelo. The Mishnah's already noted that the victim has to deal with the carcass. So Gemara says, you're right, chada b'tam, chada b'muad. The Mishnah repeats it so that we know that this is not just true of a tam, but also of a muad. We'll explain. If we know that a tam, in a tam, when the animal's still naive, it hasn't been habituated. If the Mishnah just says tam, a naive animal, the carcass goes to the victim, then I would think mishum dakati lo yayid, because it hasn't been habituated. Aval muad emaloi, but a habituated animal, I would think maybe part of the penalty of having a habituated animal is that the aggressor has to deal with the carcass. So that's why the Mishnah needs to repeat itself and say no. Also by muad, you have to deal with the carcass.
So if the animal
victim
doesn't die,
then correct. Then it's the full damages. There is no carcass to deal with. So let's say the animal has
dies, a couple of weeks later as a result.
So that's a good question. So I guess that's how we would evaluate the animal. So in other words, did the animal provide any value for the next 5 weeks? Could it have been used in the fields? Was there any benefit? If there was, then I presume you probably subtract that from the total value of the animal. If there wasn't, you wouldn't, and the carcass though would only be counted at the end of the game. Okay. However, if the Mishnah would have only told us that a muad, that the carcass of the animal goes to the victim in a scenario of muad, I would think that's because muad, you pay full damages. The Torah says okay, that the victim will have to deal with the carcass. But at a time it pays half the damages, maybe we would consider that the aggressor should have to deal with the carcass because he's only making a half payment anyway. So therefore, it's necessary for the Mishnah to repeat itself twice, both tam and muad, the victim has to deal with the carcass. Okay, Toshma says the Brisa. Ma ben tam l'muad. What's the difference between a tam and a muad, a naive animal and a habituated animal? Shatam mishalom chatzi nezik migufay, muad mishalom nezik shalom min haliyah. Tam pays half damages, but limited by the maximum value of the aggressor animal. We pointed this out previously a few times. We're on this, Eric?
Yeah.
You're familiar with this difference? This distinction. Muad pays me'aliyah, that means the actual damages. Tam pays the maximum payment of the value of the aggressing animal. The complete value. So if you have a small pudgy ox that isn't worth much, that damages the winner of the county fair,
right?
The total value, and now half the winner of the county fair is going to be $1,500, and the actual value of this small old pudgy ox is $200. You pay $200, which is less. It's the complete value of the aggressing animal, but it's less than half the value of the victim animal.
That doesn't sound fair.
Yeah, this is part of the what's it called? Part of the fact that the animal isn't yet habituated. It's unusual damage. So there's a limitation of the payments. Okay. The imisa, but there seems to be another difference. There's another difference. The difference is that if I come into court and say my animal gored your animal, then according to one opinion, I am exempt from payments because it's not a compensation payment; it's a penalty payment. and I cannot penalize myself by admitting to crime. That's a general rule, right? In general, if you admit to eating non-kosher meat, do you get lashes? No. The court has to assess any penalty, not an individual, including the one who claims to commit the crime as well. The guy walks into court and says I murdered somebody. You might lock him up in prison. He's probably not safe to have around, but he would not be murdered. He would not be killed. He can't testify against himself to kill himself.
An early Fifth Amendment.
It's much more than 50 minutes.
Yeah,
much more.
Anyway, just
Much more. Yeah. I had a bunch of friends who, when I was in yeshiva, he used to visit somebody in prison who's basically his entire the entire proceedings against him was his signed confession. The guy got 10 years in prison, and there was nothing else in court other than his signed confession. They didn't bother bringing any evidence. Yeah, it's pretty freaky story. Yeah. Anyway, so the Gemara says ton of a shire. The Gemara says you're right. There's other differences, but we omitted that difference. So the Gemara says my shire to high shire, like we pointed out before. If you want to tell me there's additional differences, you have to give me another example, not just one. Because if you give me one example and one example that isn't listed in a list of distinctions, then I presume that that example is actually excluded. If you give me multiple examples, then you can make the point that it's not excluded, but it's not excluded, but it omits many things. So the Gemara says shayar chatzi kaifer. There's another difference. Muad pays kaifer, and a tam does not pay kaifer at all. What's kaifer? If an animal kills a person, if the animal is habituated, then it pays this penalty payment called kaifer, which is the value of the person. Whatever. It's the value of the person, loosely speaking. We won't go into the specifics.
Right.
But a tam, if the animal is naive and kills somebody, there's no kaifer payments. So Gemara says, no. That's not extra. As we'll see later on, the Mishnah is of the opinion that a tam actually does pay half kaifer. So if a naive animal kills a person, you do pay half kaifer. That's effectively the same as saying half damages. So it's not an addition that the Mishnah should have listed. It's the same thing as what the Mishnah said. So what else can we add? Tashma. Him is shur is plenty, a shur shall plenty. Top of 15b. Him is shur is plenty, a shur shall plenty. A guy admits my animal killed somebody. Or he says my animal killed another guy's animal. He makes a payment. My love, what's this referring to? Pitam, in a naive animal. And therefore, what do we see from here? We see that the penalty of tam, the payment of tam is compensation, not penalty. So Gemara says, no. It means muad in a muad, where the animal's been habituated. So the Gemara says, aval tam mai, with regard to tam, what are we going to say? We're going to say that you do not make, 1 second. In other words, that you'd be exempt from payment if you admit that your animal gored another person to death. Why? Because your animal's naive, and the penalty for naive animals is 0. It's a knas. It's a penalty payment. There's no compensation. If you admit to a penalty payment, you pay 0. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, in other words, if the case is that half damages is a penalty, and if you actually admit in a case of a naive animal, you'd be completely exempt from payment. If that's the case, look at the end of the brisa. Him is sure is abdishal plane. The brisa says if a guy admits that his animal killed a slave, you don't pay the 30 coins, which is a penalty. Anytime there's a fixed payment, there's always a penalty because damages necessarily have variation. Right. Let's divide it up in and of itself. 1 second. 1 second. Hold on. second here. Okay. In other words, why are we mentioning a distinction that comes to another scenario, the scenario of a slave? Let's differentiate in and of itself. I.e., when is this true that if you admit you pay damages, that's only true b'muad by an animal that's habituated. But if the animal's still naive, then you'd be exempt from payment because you admitted to a damage which does not require a compensation. It only requires a penalty, and you can't admit to a penalty payment. If you admit, you don't have to pay it. So why do we have to go to a scenario of a slave and say that over there, if you admit, you're exempt? We can go to a scenario of a naive animal. Gemara says it's not so difficult because kula b'muad kamari. The penalty of a slave is only when the animal is habituated. So the entire Bryce is talking about a habituated animal, and that's where the Bryce doesn't want to talk about a naive animal. Okay. Stop it.